Well, so from what I understand and what I've kind of gathered, in a sense, from a little bit of background research on the Psychic Vampire Codex and some other things, a lot of the practice of psychic vampirism is, in some ways, very similar to what many people consider a general shamanic practice. Would you tell us a little bit about the similarities, the differences between the two mindsets?
Actually, I'm really glad you brought up shamanism because in studying shamanism first through Mircea Eliada's Shamanism Techniques of Ecstasy, and then the more practical application of shamanism with Michael Harner's works, I realized that if we had had a pop culture image of a shaman that was put forth with as much vim and vigor as I suspect a lot of people in the modern vampire subculture would be identifying as shamans rather than vampires. There is still that sense of someone who exists on the edge between life and death, whose experience with chronic illness has in some ways enlightened them to new ways of healing themselves and others, who are walkers between and who have this integral relationship with both the world of the living and the world of spirits. And there is just so many parallels between shamanic practices, particularly the techniques of healing yourself and others through a combination of will work and the channeling of energy and connecting to realms that are numinous but surround us at all times. It's not a one-for-one thing in the respect that, like most Americans, would associate shamanism strictly with Native American practices, and yet shamanism as a healing technique is something that you see in cultures around the world.
Mm-hmm. And one of your lectures, I believe, it details a very similar practice to many shamanic initiation rites, the idea of a spiritual death. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
I write a lot about death and rebirth. I was in and out of the hospital for the first 5 years of my life, and I had at least 2 near-death experiences that I'm aware of. And so I'm really fascinated with what that opens up in terms of somebody's experience. I didn't realize as a child that I had a different attitude toward life and death until, dealing with other people, I realized that they were afraid of it. I'd already faced that and realized that there was nothing it could do to hurt me. So that's one of the things that inspired my study of shamanism, and oddly also Carl Jung, because the idea of the shamanic dream time and all of this journeying with these archetypal images just dovetails perfectly with Jung's ideas of the collective unconscious. What I do with my death and rebirth classes and with my book, Walking the Twilight Path, is I take all of that shamanic background, I take the idea of death and rebirth in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and I take all of this context and I put it in language that we as Westerners can understand, that we can relate to, because I think as a society we have a fairly unhealthy attitude toward death. Right. Mostly we try to avoid it. We shuffle it away. We don't want to have to look at it. We used to wash the bodies of our own loved ones. We would display them in our parlors. We would have an integral part in the process of letting go. We don't have that anymore, and I'm trying to encourage us to reclaim that on many levels, and also in a way that allows us to come to terms with death so that we live life more fully.
That's very interesting. You've mentioned Carl Jung a few times, who's certainly one of my favorite thinkers. I know in a lot of what I've come to believe and think has been very profoundly influenced by him. And in my studies of occult history, especially over the last century, Jung is one of those names that keeps popping up over and over and over again. Do you think there's any specific reason why his mentality as a psychologist, among many other things, seems to dovetail, like you said, so clearly with occult philosophy these days?
I think, first of all, a lot of the answers about how Jung connects the bridge between psychology and psychic experience, I think that will be answered significantly with the publication of his Red Book. He went through a process, a very shamanic process of plumbing the depths of his own psyche, and he kept a journal. It is almost an illuminated manuscript. And they recently got permission from his family to reproduce this book that has sat in, it has sat in a bank in Switzerland in a lockbox for years and years. No one but his family has seen it because it is so revealing about his own journey. But Jung stands at the intersection of our psychological background as well as Gnostic beliefs, a kind of a wholesale and holistic personal experience of God. One of my favorite Jung quotes is, Vacatus atque non vacatus Deus aderit. Bidden or unbidden, God is present. The idea that the divine is within all of us and within all things, and that is not something that necessarily goes against the idea that also, our psyche, we see images and symbols and things, that there's relevance in the stories that we tell ourselves. I came to Carl Jung by way of Joseph Campbell, the great mythologian, who really looked at the world in terms of the stories that we tell ourselves. And I think those stories help us to define ourselves and our reality. And I think Jung understood the power of that myth to shape and direct the energy of our psyche, to change us, to change our lives, to change our worlds.
Absolutely. Now, another one of your roles as or another one of your lectures and classes is on one of my personal favorite authors, Howard Phillips Lovecraft, who's, absolutely. And he's another one of those names that keeps popping up more and more so these days. Could you tell us a little bit about how he's influenced you guys?
Lovecraft's first influence on me was literally as a fiction writer. I discovered Lovecraft through the works of Stephen King. I grew up reading Stephen King, and then I found that Stephen King's inspiration was this dude named Lovecraft, and I'd never heard of Lovecraft at the time. So I made a point of digging up Lovecraft's work, and he is really the father of weird fiction, of supernatural fiction, and he had this amazing concept called supernatural realism, that if you are going to write horror fiction, if you're going to write supernatural fiction, you want it to echo real life in such a significant way that when you add the supernatural elements, they are more gripping and they seem more real and more terrifying because of their reality. In many ways, I see him as the father of the modern genre, urban fantasy, that you see with authors like Jim Butcher or Laurel K. Hamilton. Jim Butcher is a personal favorite, and he uses Lovecraftian elements in some of his stuff, too.
Sure.
Lovecraft also dovetails with a lot of the Jung stuff. Lovecraft was someone who, as a child, was plagued with nightmares. He had these archetypal experiences with what he called night gaunts. And he took his personal experiences, the demons of his own psyche, and he wrote them out, exercising them in his fiction. He gave them form and sometimes meaning as well, I think. And by exploring, the dream quest of unknown Kadath, the archetypal boogeymen of the elder gods and Cthulhu, he created a whole new myth.
Oh, absolutely. And
I think he really understood the power of that myth, which again brings us to Campbell and Jung and kind of the trinity of my scholarly thinking. Jung, Campbell, and Victor Turner, who Turner's take on everything is the rituals we do every day. Ritual as a psychological function, ritual as a sociological function. Again, it hinges on symbol, on myth, and the stories we tell ourselves to give our lives meaning.
Absolutely.